Welcome everyone, or welcome back to the Charleston Forum's virtual discussion series. We are very pleased to have with us today U.S. Senator Tim Scott. Senator Scott has been an early supporter of the forum and a continuous one, so thank you, Senator, for joining us.
Absolutely, good to be with you. Thank you very much.
Great. A couple of quick points before we get started, and I'll note we have somewhat of an abbreviated session with the Senator today because his public duties are calling him this afternoon. So we'll be breaking shortly before 3 o'clock, and John Simpkins will be running that program for us, of course. A quick note to some sponsors who have supported us and joined us since our last discussion series. We have the law firm of Gallivan, White & Boyd, thank you, and the Bruce Law Firm, who's been a consistent supporter throughout the years. And I might add that the principal of the Bruce Law Firm is also the founder of another nonprofit named Service Before Self, which helps Low Country veterans and their families. So thank you again for your support. Also, please mark on your calendar June 14th, Sunday at 2 p.m. for the virtual discussion to reveal our survey results for our Tri-County area and where we are at this day in our 350th year as a settlement and now city and Tri-County area on issues of race in education, economics, criminal justice and policing, and the future of the past. We hope you'll join us. And without further ado, John Simpkins, thank you again for hosting. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Senator Scott, for joining us. I know your time is short, but we're gonna get right to it, if that's all right with you.
Yes, sir.
First question I have for you is, as we go through this pandemic and all the economic turmoil that results from it, what's the most important lesson are you taking away from this moment?
Well, I think there is perhaps two really important lessons from my perspective, John. The first perspective is that together we achieve more. Frankly, as we face down this pandemic, it's been really heartening to see the global response to the pandemic and how getting the great minds of the world together to work towards some type of treatment. It has been really profound how much brain power, how much enthusiasm actually can be infectious. And frankly, even here at home, to watch my friends on the left work with their friends on the right to pass historic relief packages 96-0 in the Senate and on a voice vote in the House. These are what we would consider modern day miracles. It's like Jesus walking on the water, frankly. It is something we have not seen. No one would have ever predicted or could have even imagined a day where the rhetoric and the toxicity in the society would dissipate long enough to get work done on behalf of the strong, powerful nation that we are. So that's one real strong takeaway, that we are better together. Second takeaway is that seeing the glass half full or half empty, you're going to be right. And so it's really important that we focus on what we have and then work from there. I like to look at the fact that this pandemic has shown the intrinsic value to life that we place as Americans in a way that is, frankly, I think, breathtaking and awesome at the same time. We know that we look at our goals between now and August, that any loss of lives are too many, and we've lost too many Americans already. But the truth is that as we look to the future, because we've been willing to practice the social distancing and the hygiene protocols, as well as taking care of ourselves on behalf of others, wearing masks so that we don't spread what we have to others, all of those things combined is having a dramatic impact on flattening the curve, which allows for us to have the second part of the conversation, which is how to deal with the economic tsunami that has been caused by a healthcare crisis.
What do you think it would take for us to build on this moment of solidarity, of people working across party lines for the common good?
Well, I think it takes the reflection on why we came to the same place for the common good. It's because we had an emergency big enough that we put aside our own petty partisan politics and the things that kind of irritate us about each other. And we decided that they were so petty, so insignificant, that the challenge in front of us was so important that we focused only on the challenge in front of us. Said differently, when you focus on others, you find that your happiness goes up, that your depression goes down. In our society, from a political perspective, we've been living in the midst of a depression. And frankly, because of the urgent need of the American people, and I mean that literally, the American people, both sides came together and said, this is not a time for pettiness. This is not a time for politics. This is not a time for positioning. This is actually a time for getting things done. And we joined hands, and both sides and different people didn't like everything in the package, but they said, this is good enough for me. And that is not something you often hear, good enough for me. You typically hear, I need perfect or purity. And when that is not the objective, getting help to the people who desperately need it is the objective. I'm really impressed with what we can do as a people, one American family working to look out for each other. So looking forward, that's exactly how we continue to make progress, is to have that aftermath mentality, hopefully without having to go through a crisis. When you have the aftermath mentality, you're worried about your brother, you're worried about your sister, you're worried about your friends, your family, and frankly, you redefine the definition of friends and family. I've seen people hanging out and talking to neighbors that they hadn't done anything other than wave at when they go by. Now they're having real conversations. So we're actually strengthening the common thread throughout our communities in a powerful way.
It's nothing like a crisis to concentrate the collective mind. And
Yes.
You have in the past worked on a bipartisan basis with your colleagues in the Senate. One particular effort that comes to mind is around opportunity zones. And I want to ask you a question that it actually also comes from one of our viewers. What do you see as the role of opportunity zones in the process of reopening and recovery?
Well, John, thanks for the question, and to the viewer who asked the question, God bless you, because I love talking about opportunity zones. There's no doubt that opportunity zones will play a significant role in our recovery long term, and frankly, short term, it will be helpful. I say that for this reason. I was at the White House yesterday, and we were talking about the importance of opportunity zones in recovery, and what we was able to discern is that we have about $75 billion private sector dollars waiting to be deployed throughout this nation in the areas that are hardest hit by the epidemic, and frankly, the areas that were before the epidemic, the poorest parts of America. So the good news is that is larger than the benefits of the tax reform package as a whole. It's larger than most initiatives to help people in poverty that this nation has seen. So it will be very helpful, but more important, John, I think is what it represents. What it represents is an incentive-based economy. And for us to come out of this current crisis, we're going to have to focus on an incentive-based economy. We're going to have to take a second look at ways that we incentivize the investment of resources in areas and in businesses in a way that we haven't before. I liken back to the days when you had a tax deduction for eating out at restaurants. And in Charleston and throughout this nation, there are a lot of restaurants that were shuttered. And the question about bringing them back will be, there's going to have to be an incentive to motivate people to come back to the restaurants. The same will be true with retail. There are Macy's, JCPenney's, some of the brands that you would never have thought 20 years ago would be bankrupt. And now they are on the verge, if not in the process of bankruptcy. So I think having an incentive-based economy is the fastest way for us to see the economic activity that will save lives and save a lot of homes.
And you mentioned some tax incentives, and tax breaks mean loss of revenue. That means unrealized revenue for that particular activity. There was a recent article that called for as much as $10 trillion in stimulus spending over the next 4 years. How do we determine how much is enough? And how much are we willing to spend to avoid economic collapse?
That's a great question. Let me address the first point, which is the tax revenues that are lost by having tax cuts in place. What we've learned from the 2017 tax reform package is that the revenues to the Treasury were actually up because of the tax cuts, and so those tax cuts have actually been producing more revenues, not fewer dollars, to the CBO. The Congressional Budget Office has been able to confirmed the fact that we had some of our best months in 2019 as a result of the tax cuts. But the broader question is, how much do we spend? And that's a great question. So if you look at the current two packages, we consider it 3.0 and 3.5, those two combined together represents nearly $3 trillion in assistance. But if you add in appropriately the $450 billion that we have identified for the commercial paper facilities, that was a part of the two packages, that is actually $450 billion to be multiplied by about 8 or 9 in the financial institutions. So that's another $3.5 to $4 trillion for mid-sized and larger companies to be able to create the liquidity that they need in order to continue their operations. It's similar to the PPP, which is the most popular part. Perhaps maybe the $1,200 check is more popular than the PPP, but the PPP Paycheck Protection Program for smaller businesses that becomes a grant is very similar to that, except for the one caveat that it's a loan, but it's low interest loans. That whole package together is about $6 trillion of benefit coming out of the first phase. So how much more do we need on top of that is the question. And the best way to answer that question is to see what the first two tranches, what the impact of those two tranches are in our economy before we enter into a third phase. It's kind of hard to know what exactly we need when we haven't really spent the first two phases combined. I am looking forward to seeing what that is. There's probably a more than 50% chance that there will be another iteration of the CARES concept, but it's hard for us to identify or earmark where those resources would go without first giving the direct $3 trillion and the additional $3 trillion and some change the time to circulate and then germinate within our economy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Senator Scott, as you know, we met over 10 years ago in the Liberty Fellowship, which is a program of the Aspen Institute that is meant to encourage values-based leadership in South Carolina and to promote a generation of values-based leaders in South Carolina. And I just had a question for you. When I met you, you were the chair of Charleston County Council in 2008. And in 5 years, you were a U.S. Senator with a couple stops in between. So it was a bit of a meteoric rise. And all through that time, you've had this experience of going through this process of evaluating what you stand for in relation to how you show up as a leader. And the question I have for you is, how do your values influence your decisions right now as a U.S. Senator?
You know, John, they are, I remember very fondly our time in the class together with the 20 of us trying to figure out how to make South Carolina a better place to live. And I remember how intimidating it was to be in a class with John Simpkins, a Harvard grad and man who writes constitutions for African nations and married to a beautiful smart woman. I'm sorry?
You need to answer the question.
No, I'm listening. This is a part of the answer, unfortunately, John. This is how you answer these questions because this is just the way that it is. And I remember thinking to myself, my goodness, how in the world do we work together? And what I did was I looked at my faith, and I feel like my faith foundation is what allowed me to participate in that classroom, even though I was intimidated by good folks like yourself. And I came to the conclusion that the good Lord placed me exactly where he wanted me to be at the exact time he wanted me to be there with the exact experience I needed to contribute to where I was. And every step of the way, I've leaned on my faith, not as a crutch, but as a foundation to stand on. And I will say that I've seen a lot of crisis in this nation since I was elected to the Senate and frankly, even to the House. And every time that I see the crisis, whether it was the Emmanuel church shooting, whether it was the Walter Scott shooting, Trayvon Martin, whether it was the 2015 1,000-year flood, now in a global pandemic, the one thing I keep being reminded of is as Daniel Simmons Jr. said less than a week after his father was murdered in church, was Romans 8:28. that we know all these things will work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. I use that as a foundation because I was a depressed man walking on the floor of the Senate to give a speech about the lost lives. And I was talking to Daniel Simmons Jr. when I was getting ready to go out there. And he was the last person I spoke to 2 minutes before I went and spoke about his family. His words stunned me. They shocked me. And they helped me regain perspective. And so my value proposition to this nation is not to force what I believe on others, but to make sure that I never forget why I am so fortunate and blessed to be where I am. And that is just to share love, to be a purveyor of hope, and then to craft good, solid policies without thinking about Republicans or Democrats, conservatives or liberals, but thinking about how do I make sure that this nation is good for where we are today, but better for those who come behind me. And so it is perhaps my silver bullet is bringing a faith-filled, value-based approach to service, realizing that I am the least of these and perhaps the most flawed.
Thank you for that answer. And I just have a short follow-up. How do your values and how does your deep belief in Christian teachings influence your views on racial equity?
Tremendously. I mean, I'm a big believer that my faith is necessary for me to appreciate those who don't believe as I believe, frankly, especially I believe in racial progress. I believe that we are better together. I remember one of the first articles written about me as a young county council member back in the mid 90s or early 90s was about the fact that I felt like I was supposed to build a racial bridge, that I wanted to help bring people together. And the atrocities and challenges I've seen since then really harkens me back to the same place we were just talking about, that we are better together. When I read through faith, when I read through scripture, I think about Moses, who had an African wife, and I think about Solomon's love affair with different folks as well. And I think about how there's a unity in scripture that sometimes we miss on the black side and the white side. And frankly, on the God side, it seems like he's, I wouldn't say colorblind because he's not, but I would say that it seems like we have a chance to just experience life together and put aside the things that separate us. And I will say in my office now, I have folks of the Hindu faith, of no faith, of the Jewish faith, and we all have a chance to talk just about what we believe in. We don't have to believe the same to want the same outcome. And what we want as an outcome is people who respect each other enough to work together, and then who are wise enough to listen to someone else's experience, even if it's diametrically opposed to yours, so that we can benefit from it. And that's what we saw, frankly, in June of 2015, is we saw this coming together on the Ravenel Bridge, not of Christians, not of Hindus or Muslims or Jews. We saw this coming together of people of good conscience who believed that it was their responsibility to take a lead and to make a statement with their actions, not by thumping a Bible or thumping something else, but by standing up in solidarity on behalf of a state and a city that was rocked to our core. And so I'm thankful to be a part of a community that loves each other, even when we disagree, loves each other when we go to different houses of worship, but loves each other because we have learned that we are better together.
So on that note, I want to ask you another question about what you see as a critical problem, maybe the most critical problem today that we can address regardless of political affiliation, regardless of faith or no faith. What is that one thing that you think we can come together to be better at solving that we're not doing right now?
Yeah, I honestly think that in the current times in which we live, we need more purveyors of hope. I think when hope is lost, as a kid, I lost my hope for making a difference or being a difference or even being productive. And it's one of the reasons why I did so poorly in high school as a freshman. I felt like my life did not have meaning, and I was a fairly disruptive force as a freshman in high school. And I have found that people without hope, if you're hopeless, you do the most amazing things, but they're mostly destructive. And if we could be purveyors of hope and make sure that our hope is founded upon a constant activity that requires me to do something to build that hope up. And then the thing I would suggest that we could do as a community is focus on literacy and financial literacy. So many of our problems in this world and in our nation is surrounding poverty. The greatest divide isn't a black divide or a white divide or a red divide or a brown divide. It really is the green divide. And to the extent that we can close the gap between the haves and have-nots, we will have done a tremendous good for our nation and frankly for the world, because as goes America, so goes the world. So I've spent a lot of time, but not just as an elected official, but just as an individual, trying to focus on financial literacy as a part of my personal mission statement that I established at 19 years old. It's so important for us to focus on literacy specifically and financial literacy as another very important part of our journey.
One last question before we get you out of here. What does the new normal look like to you?
You know, that's a great question. It's an open-ended question, so I'll take about 12 minutes to answer the question. Just joking.
You can vote.
Yeah, about 7 more minutes before I have to go to vote. The votes were a little late. The new normal, from my perspective, there's an immediate definition and then there's a long-term definition. The immediate definition includes all the necessary social protocols being in place so that we can walk towards reopening the economy as a nation. We'll do that sector by sector, region by region, and sometimes demographic by demographic. We're going to have to, in my opinion, understand who the most vulnerable are in our society: nursing home residents, our seniors, people with 2 or more underlying health conditions. And we're going to have to figure out how to get the rest of our nation to get back to socializing using those social protocols over the next few months. After that, I think we're going to have treatments in place, and I think we're going to have a vaccine towards the end of the year, if not January, February of next year. And frankly, who knows? We may get, really blessed and have something in the form of a cure-ish kind of thing. So I'm excited about that. That will be a different kind of normal. I think that normal in August and September, if in fact we get a treatment sometime this summer, that new normal will eclipse this current normal, and we'll go back to something that is about 70% of where we were before. I think we're going to have more teleworking than we've ever had before. I think we're going to have more people involved in homeschooling or virtual schools than we've ever had before. I also think we're going to have an acceleration towards telemedicine and using technology as a way of connecting people, which means broadband becomes a top priority of mine and around the nation. So I think the new normal, not looking at counting heads in restaurants or hotels, it's going to be how technology and the gig economy was accelerated into our society and embedded into our culture as a real norm. That's going to be very interesting to see how quickly we embrace that and how quickly we're able to teach that to folks who are needing of the teachers on the technology side.
Thank you for that.
Yes,
and
sir.
Thank you for agreeing to join us. And I just want to wish you well. Thank you for your service. And we're glad we were able to at least spend a little bit of time with you, and hopefully we can get you back at some point.
Well, thank you for fitting me, and thank you for your leadership, John. May you continue to be blessed with good health and an intellectual curiosity that is typically unmatched. Have a great day.
Thank you, Senator. You
Yes,
too.
sir.